Okay, let's do this. Good morning, everybody. Hello, welcome. My name is Stefan Lehmann, live from Las Vegas, from the great state of Nevada. I welcome you to our session, Research Methods in Environmental Design. As more people come online, we are recording the session. We are very happy to have our guest already online here, Professor Michael Hensel from Vienna, Austria. Good morning, Michael. It's 7 p.m. at your end. Great to see you. You're doing well. And I want to give a short introduction to Michael in a minute. I want to point out that later the students are presenting on their research proposals. And on Friday, we have Perkins Will lecture talking to us about the use of research in their practice. So very happy to have Michael with us. He is also AA school alumnus. If I'm right, Michael, which year did you graduate?
93.
Okay, 2 years after me. So this means I'm 2 years older. So I should explain, Professor Michael Hensel is an architect and author with research interests in performance-oriented design. He's going to tell us all about what it is. And since 2018, since 4 years, he holds the chair of the Department for Digital Architecture and Planning at the Institute of Architectural Science at the Vienna University of Technology. He is also a partner in ocean architecture. And as I mentioned earlier, he studied in London at the AA school. And it's wonderful. We're going to have some hard questions later for you. But we were planning to have your talk maybe 45 minutes, around 45 minutes, and then open up for conversation, discussion, and have a chat about what you presented. And so I would suggest then over to you. And again, a very warm welcome from all of us, Michael. And I allow you sharing your slides if you want to bring up your slides or start talking. Thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Yes, thank you for the invitation, Stefan, and for your kind introduction. Just so that nobody gets upset, I actually don't hold the chair of the Institute for Architectural Science. That would be my boss. I'm running the Department for Digital Architecture and Planning. So let me just share. Actually, on the poster, it said the title was mentioned as Changing Practice. I put this into plural for various reasons that might or might not become apparent during the talk. And I will talk about the impact of research on reshaping architectural practice, in part as a kind of broader observation and in part related to what I'm doing in practice with my colleagues. So I'm personally, like most of my colleagues, both a practitioner and an academic and researcher. So the work is taking place in a practice called Ocean. I will tell you a little bit more about that in a second. And the work in academia is predominantly taking place in the context of the Department of Digital Architecture and Planning, but with a broad network of collaborators, especially in research, as is normal. So let me first share with you, I never wanted to be an architect. My parents said, hey, what about architecture? And I said, no, thanks, couldn't possibly bother. But I became an architect somehow, lo and behold. And since then, I'm trying to make sense of what architecture really is. So I don't have any answers to anything. I only have more questions, if you don't mind. So my struggle with architecture is basically, what is it that we're doing as architects? And obviously, like most things in the living world, things evolve. They're not always the same. So, and also we can only perceive a certain breadth of the larger picture. And we can look into it, we can try to educate ourselves, but we will never capture the big picture as a whole. But this gentleman here was depicted on the Technical Weekly in Norway, 1893, and he's sort of like doing what most people think architects do, drawing buildings and thinking about proportions, evaluating some aesthetics of a facade, for instance, an elevation, and so on. So it's basically very object-oriented. And that is, I guess, broadly the picture of that people have of architects, and broadly also the picture that architects might have of themselves, at least to some extent. But when going through recent publications, one finds architects doing rather strange things. Or let's say people employed in architectural practices. So we might see two things here. That not only architects are employed in architectural practices, and that architects engage with strange things that are probably less to do with the building than with processes related to environment in which construction takes place. Yeah, you see here a researcher at Kieran Timberlake, for instance, looking at progression of different plant distributions over the years on the green roof. Or this was my team in Norway when I was in Norway doing measurements in a terraced vineyard. So this is odd. It's not exactly that person standing in front of a drawing board looking at proportional relations in a design of a facade, but rather looking at broadly dynamic open processes within the environment. Now, of course, the question is about the role of research, and for that we need to have some sort of definition. For now, I will just simply borrow a definition that comes from the UK Research Excellence Framework. And they define research as a process of investigation leading to new insights effectively shared. Now, a process of investigation, of course, it's a question, what does that mean? What does it entail? Leading to new insight, okay, that can be somehow evaluated. But maybe the problem lies in effectively shared, as we might see. Because, as you all know, those of you that participate in research, we publish in scientific journals or elsewhere. We basically bring back our findings to a larger community so that these activities can be reproduced and that the findings can be to the benefit of a larger field of interest, a particular expert domain, etc. Around 2010, I started developing an interest in how different practices actually pursue research. And I was working with a colleague of mine from Chalmers University in Gothenburg in Sweden, and we decided to embark on an investigation looking at different practices that are renowned for doing research. Quite quickly, you begin to realize that such an undertaking can serve different purposes. So when you ask what is practice-oriented research and what do practices research and how do practices conduct and facilitate research, you come to a study of practices that conduct research at a certain kind of breadth of practices. And then from there might follow. For the practices themselves that engage in this process, it's a self-reflective process in which they see what they actually do, can become more conscious about it and begin to strategize it in different ways. For practices that are not currently engaged in research, there's a potential to identify and adapt models in the way in which other practices do this kind of thing and to see how they can embed that into their own work. And of course, for universities, it's an interesting question. What are kind of inquiries go on in practice? How one might relate to that, collaborate with it, and also maybe bring new impulses into this kind of environment. So theoretically, a win-win situation, but somehow, strangely, no interest from funding organizations to help with this research. So what I'm showing to you now in this first part is research where we had to really cobble together pennies from different places and from different foundations, etc., to undertake what was essentially a decade of dedicated research on top of all the other work that we were doing. because nobody gives you free time for that either. It's a not third party funded research, so you have to fund it somehow through different means, and you have to find additional time and resources to do this. Until now, 3 main publications came out of that, and if you wish, you may take a look at those, especially the one in the middle and the one to the right, the Changing Shape of Practice, Changing Shape of Architecture, together with Fredrik Nielsen. We looked at a whole variety of different practices, literally reporting together with the practitioners about how research is conducted. And what we tried to do here is to have a good geographic spread, but also, and more importantly, a way of looking at the field that is somehow a bit more organized. And what we try to do is look at practices of different sizes because of the difference in resourcing, and trying to see whether there are certain discernible models within which these practices incorporate and facilitate research in their day-to-day activities. So this whole thing started really first with a seminar where we tried to discuss, and you see this little gentleman here from the technical weekly from Norway, and was always with us when we tried to contemplate what actually discipline-specific knowledge in architecture is. And lo and behold, we were sitting there with a lot of experts from different countries, from all over the world, very learned scholars, etc. But after 3 days, we probably knew less about what is discipline-specific knowledge in architecture than at the beginning of the 3 days. The more you dig, the more questions come up, the more doubts arise. And it was a very strange undertaking and a strange exercise to go through. To follow this up, we thought we start a series of symposia with different practices. So here, this was the first one in Gothenburg, where we had people from Kieran Timberlake, Foster and Partners, Helen and Hart, 3XN from Denmark, and White Architects from Sweden, discussing their research. But what we realized in the first symposium already is that there were very clear differences in terms of the understanding of what is intellectual property and what it might mean to effectively share insights. And so I will not name any particular practice, but the range went from, I would like to show you what we do in our research, but I can't because these are intellectual property rights protected issues, where you really wonder, hey, why did you come here to tell us this? You could have stayed at home. You could have said, well, I cannot really show anything in this symposium, all the way to people saying, well, you know, we share our research findings with the community, and what we try and do is profile, in so doing, we try to profile the research capacity of our practice. So we're basically essentially showing that we're good researchers. And this is quite a span if you think about it, from I can't share anything with you, which then wouldn't be according to the definition I showed you earlier on research, because it's not effectively shared, towards a very open way of dealing with your intellectual property. In between, there are then people that are also very open with their research, but they might develop certain methods and tools that they have proprietary rights and that they market and so on. So outcomes on a methodological or on a tool level, etc. So you see different things are possible there. And so we continued this year after year. We had different people. So here, Helen Hart, Karen Timberlake, Shops, Nohetta, Voigt, and White. And later it became bigger and bigger. This is now 2017 in Denmark. And here we had a very interesting mixed funding situation where Aarhus, the place where this took place, was European Cultural Capital. So we had some funds from there, a whole variety of different funds from smaller foundations, Dreyer funds, for instance, and a lot of self-financed travel and so on, because some people were simply interested in participating in this and showing what they were doing and hearing from others what they are doing in terms of research. Also at that time, more and more different educational activities, bringing together different universities, etc., together with practice partners, new models for organizing master thesis projects and so on came up. So really very interesting that the field was diversifying. Until then, 2018 in Munich, where the broader repercussions of this way of working and incorporating research in terms of architecture, profession and education was discussed. That was one thing. And in the following year, there was a conference also in Germany on research cultures, really. How do you set up and nourish research cultures? So you see, the field was broadening out. It was not just a question of what do individual practices do, but how does that sit with an entire disciplinary field? So let me just give you a few things that we worked on. We looked, for instance, very large practices, more than 500 employees. What kind of models dominate there in terms of facilitating research? So you would, for instance, see large practices that really had purpose-configured expert groups within their compartmentalized practice structure. For instance, foster and partner, that would be an example, versus other large practices that would hire in entire expert groups for a certain amount of time in order to deliver a certain project. But then later to basically let go of this. For instance, an example would be a large practice name I don't want to mention right now, but hiring in, for instance, a whole group of people in terms of sports architectures in order to facilitate a very large global sport event. Now, these different ways of facilitating research, there are either slightly more rigid, where you have departments internally, or a little bit more flexible, where you hire in your people, but it's or some people temporarily, but it's very compartmentalized. If you go down a scale to practices that were about 120 at the time, I now changed it to 150 because they've grown a little bit in the meantime. You have different models. For instance, one where you have different researchers on the office floor that are dynamically moving around, sometimes between research projects, sometimes between projects that are going on in the practice that need expert inputs. One absolutely fabulous example would be Kieran Timberlake in Philadelphia. It's wonderful what they're doing. They have people with a lot of double degrees in environmental sciences, sometimes combined with architecture or with other scientific disciplines. And it's really quite nice to see the picture that I showed you earlier on of that young lady sitting on that green roof, looking at the plant distribution, the succession of it. So this was taking a project done by the practice, again, back as also a kind of living laboratory. So this is basically changing the idea of what the project is as something that you deliver at the point of completion, and that is that, towards a type of post-occupation studies that are much broader than what we normally get to see. It's not just about how people inhabit buildings. It's really about a very broad range of environmental considerations and dynamics which are interacting there. Other practices of a certain size might have an affiliated research unit, for instance, 3XN in Copenhagen with its research branch. It's an independent business with its own economy. GXN, a group that does anything from white papers to supporting the mother office with large projects that require a degree of research to solve and address certain projects or problems within a given project. So again, quite versatile. There would also be shop architects, for instance, that generated a second office that would deliver projects of that sort and at the degree of quality that was required by the design office and so on. Of course, the smaller it gets, the more difficult it is to resource the skills that you need. So we have seen some practices that invested into sending different office members into different fields to acquire knowledge and skills. For instance, I don't know, timber construction or new forms of social housing, as is the case, for instance, with Helen and Hart. Here you always have to make sure that when one specialist leaves, that you're not left without the expertise. So you need at least 2 or 3 people with a similar profile in the practice. And so you basically educate your own people in the process, and you allow them to be both generalist, but with also a specialist kind of understanding, tapping into the field. And then there are also practices that work where the partners or somebody in the practice is actively teaching in the university and may actually have set up an affiliated research unit, and then there can be some sort of exchange on that level. I got to the point at the end of this research where I started thinking about the issue of lifelong learning. And who's actually responsible, who claims to be responsible for delivering that, and who's actually delivering what in this respect. So basically, we're talking about us studying for 5 or whatever years to the master, possibly with a PhD, no longer being able to assume that the knowledge and the skills that we have acquired will last us for 40 years in profession. We need to rethink, reskill, retool at certain intervals. Sometimes this may be required by the National Chambers of Architects. I think in the United States, that is somehow a requirement that you attend conferences and you do certain things to basically get in tune with new contemporary developments, whatever that may be, building law, building physics, whatever it is. Universities sometimes claim they do something about it, but when you really look, what is on offer is relatively small. But what I found is that without naming it as such, or even being fully conscious of that, that is what a lot of the practices, particularly in the small to medium size range, somewhere between 20 to 150, were essentially doing with their employees by generating environments on the work floor, or by engendering people to go and participate in events or in research activities that would update them. So that's really interesting. Now, it's not just an element of doing research, it also means that you're basically taking care of your staff and your resources to be right there at the point where they should be. So it's interesting that practice, to some extent, or at least the practices that are engaged in this kind of way, are taking care of the thing that some university claim they are doing, or that is essentially a responsibility of the Chamber of Architects. I find that a very interesting insight. And once you have gained that insight, you can become conscious about it, and you can make that part of your strategic development plan for your own practice. Okay, that's what I wanted to share with you, and that's maybe in its own right a takeaway for those of you that want to engage in this kind of work, or that even want to set up your own practice to incorporate that in your thinking. What I'm now going to show you is the practice that I've been active in, Ocean. So this has gone through, let's say, 4 distinct phases. We started as a very loose collective in '94, working for 4 years as Ocean Network. First, several of us who studied at the Architectural Association in London, then people started moving out of London, then we collaborated between different kinds of towns. And then in '98, somehow the network had become a little bit sort of like difficult to understand and operate. So there was a small contraction where 3 offices in Cologne, Oslo, and Helsinki formed Ocean North. So this was a kind of a shrinking to a healthy state where we would be more able to steer the ship, while at the same time pursuing certain shared research interests. At the time, we were not necessarily calling this research by design in practice. We considered that experimental practice, but because we were very much interested in the methodology aspect of our work, it very quickly became something that took on more formal research patterns, let's say, and activities. So we worked like this for 10 years, and we began to realize that we had hit a point where we wanted to go deeper into the areas that we wanted to investigate, but couldn't do it as a practice. Simply because we could not generate as a practice the money necessary to do that, in spite of a lot of academic engagements of the different partners involved. So in 2008, we turned the practice Ocean North into a not-for-profit organization, Design Research Association, registered in Norway, as a public association where we engaged in research activities and where we could also fund research activities. This went on for 10 years. And then at the end of these 10 years, two things happened. We realized that through these 10 years, leading figures in the group had developed areas of specialization that were hard at that point to integrate, because we didn't pay enough attention to keeping that kind of close link. And so things branched out a little bit. But at the same time, we had also fulfilled our agenda for that decade to generate particular approaches to architecture. So in my case, I was very interested in performance-oriented architecture. Another colleague more in the design field, Birgit Sevaldsson, he developed an approach towards systems-oriented design that developed very quickly in what is today the Systemic Design Association, and so on. So these became large associations and societies in their own right, at the point of which Ocean had served its purpose and couldn't move further as a design research association. So back to the roots, we shrunk to a very small scale, set up Ocean Architecture and Environment to exercise our knowledge and skills that we had gained in a series of consultancy works and project works. And in 2020, we reinstigated OceanNet as a more dynamic setup. What is also interesting is when you look at that schedule or this development over time from the perspective of what was happening to the economy globally at that time. At the time that we changed from practice to Design Research Association, 2008, the big crash. So in a way, it would have been necessary to reorganize practice anyhow, but in this case, we try to make a positive thing out of it. And instead of just simply returning to a more kind of informal form of operation, we decided to go for a formal operation, but focused on research and really developing something for the broader community. So we are never more than 10 people. Almost all of us are involved with formal academic research activities, and we try to have a communication between what we do there with our practice-based research by design. And I'm going to very quickly now talk a little bit about that. So we're interested in the question of designing environments, something that extends beyond sort of the built object alone. And there are several people have problematized the question of environment and have written about it, but I think there's two statements that encapsulate how contested the notion of environment really is. One is by Etienne Benson. We are environments as much as we are in environments. Just think about what's happening in your guts and you immediately understand what that statement is about. And Larry Busbear, who wrote, to design in an environment is to design an environment. So you will always cause consequences that are beyond that object that you're concentrating on, that you're focusing on, and will you take responsibility for that or not? So we try to do numerous things. Don't forget, you know, we have all this 10 years background of a design research association. So we have run a very formal developments over a large number of years. And basically the research I showed you earlier on about research and practice coincided with the time period. That was something that we did during that period. The other thing that we did for the last 5 years now is to run a series of symposia focused on architecture and environment relations with different universities, different partners, and these act as springboards for joint research cooperations. To date, we have 2 large finance projects coming out of this context, and we're trying to pursue this also from a broad interdisciplinary perspective through publications. So really, we're still, as a practice, we're still acting in the way as we did as the Design Research Association. We're still engaging very broadly with the field. One is through book series focused on designing environments with Springer Nature. And then we also do individual publications that look at the role of digitization, of data, et cetera, in terms of how we think about our urban and architectural environments. From my perspective, what I'm really interested in at this moment in time is critical zone research. In the United States, you might be far more familiar with what that is than most people elsewhere. This is basically a research that was really recognized as such and termed as such somewhere around the turn of the millennium, where a lot of interdisciplinary teams looked at locally confined areas, trying to understand what is really happening there from an interdisciplinary perspective. Maybe a river delta, maybe a certain valley, looking at the microclimate, looking at the ecology, doing deep studies into rock, soil science, geomorphology, hydrology, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the National Research Council basically said that this is sort of the environment that, quote, regulate the natural habitat and determine availability of life-sustaining resources. So I started thinking about architecture doing the exact opposite of that. No, we don't care much for the soil. We just want to get rid of the loads. We do a bit of greening, but what does that have to do with hydrological cycles or with soil science or any of those things? So what if we positively embrace critical zone research and we would say we design precisely for that, an integrated, not a discrete architecture that focuses on the object, but a non-discrete performative architecture that deals with the dynamics and the systems of the environment in a positive sense. In order to do that, you first need to understand something about the environment. And before I gained knowledge about the critical zone research, we already started something very similar in rural environments. So here you see a valley in Tuscany where we do annual field research, where we're trying to understand how the human modification of the terrain and construction is actually generating microclimate to grow red wine at a high altitude. And not just since yesterday. The first time that this quality of the wine of this region was mentioned was under Lorenzo Medici. So this is basically like 500 years, lots of climate dynamics in that time, and still somehow human intervention was able to create a very conducive and also biodiverse environment for food production. So we try to understand not only natural habitats. This is critical zone research, looks at natural, but we try to see what happens when humans have already intervened, and are we able to find interesting examples that can point us towards knowledge that is worth regaining, which is sort of the research area of my wife, Defna. She's looking very much into that, trying to see how we can understand environments, how we can rediscover the knowledge, and how we can adapt it for use in urban environments. This is multi-scale research. It goes from the territorial scale all the way down to individual features on the site, like dry stone walls. It is research that requires many different ways of acquiring data, whatever that data may be about, microclimate, terrain, soil, whatever it is. So a lot of different expertise in the acquisition of these data sets, but not only that, it is also very much about having then different activities in data collection in the site, and how you might integrate, first of all, what do you take, what you can gain in terms of insight, what's your question, what do you want to know for the sake of design. That is also data acquisition very often of data that is maybe inherent in geographic information systems, so InMake-ARC sort of approach of broad understanding of the environment. But then it comes to the difficult question, how do you integrate multi-domain and multi-scale data in such a way that you can learn something about this whole thing? I cannot go into detail. I cannot tell you what are the different things that we have looked at here, but if you just imagine we have the territorial scale of the whole valley, and then we go down to the feature scale of individual plants and the walls, and then maybe one step in the terrain, trying to understand what is active here in creating an environment in which certain things can take place that otherwise wouldn't be possible. In this case, growing high quality red wine at high altitude. So one part is understanding environments and gaining data that can be used in the design process. Another thing is to integrate that data and make it available for a computer-aided design process, and to try and see what kind of outputs you can have from here. So it's basically, how do we develop an iterative method that can permanently be enriched by new findings and new data. Workflow design in a way that is geared towards data-driven scales. Now, okay, this is interesting from an understanding environment perspective, but how about now designing something? Can design also be a vehicle? And that's what I want to talk about a little bit. One insight that I share with you right now comes from a large research project called Ecological Building Envelopes that we're currently busy with. And the point is simply here, it's one thing for different species, non-human stakeholders, to live in a natural environment. It's another thing to encounter human-made boundaries. No? This is actually from a time of COVID, so very famous moment, some place in Scotland where all these goats came into town and started eating up the gardens and so on. But the problem or the situation here was that part of what makes a street a boundary was gone. There were no hazardous things like cars, etc. So to some extent, it was possible for the animals to occupy the territory. But we have to understand that the way we look at urban form is basically, and that's an old survey tradition, that's where it's coming from. Hence the show here as an example, the Great Plan of Rome by Giambattista Nolli. We understand cities very much still by discrete objects and systems. Buildings, roads, green spaces. So one thing cannot be the other, except maybe a little bit of a green roof. But that is not helpful when you want to introduce into the city greater biodiversity, if you want to maintain ecosystems, if you want to close the gap that has occurred between humans and nature and their interaction, much to the detriment of human health and well-being. And I guess one of the questions that Stefan shared with me a couple of days ago will probably go into this direction. How can we think of cities in a way that they are more livable, more healthy, more concerned with the well-being of humans, and for that, some human nature interface is necessary. But to do that, we need to think of cities as connected networks of green spaces. We need to think of connectivity for animals to move through. So we probably need to think of the city more in terms of urban landform rather than discrete objects and boundaries. And how can we do that? And if all we have available for green spaces and green networks is the space is not occupied by buildings, then we're very limited, because built-up cities only have this much space. How do we do that? Unless we engage the individual building in it, bit by bit, incrementally. And this is where a lot of our current work in ocean is going, that we try to use every project that we do as a little experiment in that direction. So here you have the Langley Via Visitor Hub in Surrey, UK. It's in a very green area with these hedge networks and thick stands of trees, etc. There was a request for a project for a visitor center here. And basically we wanted to see, first of all, activate the time dimension more. And we wanted to see whether the building operation itself could set up a prototype for an urban environment, and whether the building could leave something behind that is something other than an empty site, flattened out. So basically you have here this X-shaped form with two legs cantilevering out from the center towards the north and the south, and then you have here two legs which are semi-buried under the soil, setting up a new artificial terrain here, partly covered underground, and then bringing the vegetation very close to that building, such that non-human stakeholders could begin to occupy part of the territory. Yeah, so you can see here, the visitors come in, they circulate through the building, and they go in and out of the building, changing from hard to soft surfaces, having different kind of encounters with nature, something that the anthropologist Tim Ingold would probably call becoming knowledgeable of the environment by walking and experiencing. And practically, you know, the building, when it is set up, the plants are set, the plants are small. We tend to draw the plants as full grown, but if it takes 100, 200 years for the plants to be full grown, the building will never be in the same spot as the full grown trees. So this is a kind of time condensed image that never exists as such. So only when the building is gone, something is left behind, like a terrain that is fully vegetated, maybe with some non-human stakeholders that permanently in some way settle there. So the building leaves something behind, the project continues after that. So it's taking the Kieran Timberlake approach from looking at the green roof and plant succession a step forward, basically saying, okay, when the building is gone and the green roof is gone, then what is left after that operation? What that often entails in our project is that we have some elevations of the building, because I spoke earlier on about this guy on the Technical Weekly, that are more recognizable as architecture. But as you move around, maybe you don't have any typical architectural facade. The object is somehow immersed or embedded in the environment in such manner that you don't perceive it as an object as such. The path through the building is really important, because here we took Tim Ingold's proposition of walking through the weather world series and literal, where we basically say that the encounter of soft soil, the encounter of weather, of air, of different natural elements is important for people to become knowledgeable about an environment and thereby perhaps develop some level of stewardship. So taking the person in and out of that building along the path around that architecture is really an important asset. It also raises the question, how much of a problem is it really when somebody comes in with muddy shoes and soils your lobby? Is that an issue? Is that a problem? Because I think our predilections for managing environments, particularly interior environments, will show that we are not used to this kind of thing. When the sand starts making noises under your shoes in your apartment, this could trigger a very different response from you than the same thing happening in front of your building. So it's this kind of architecture environment divide, this kind of human nature dialectic, is bringing with it a whole range of things down to the simplest way of when do you bring out the vacuum cleaner. It is embedded in our daily practices. So that's why it's so hard to develop stewardship for something, because we always see the thing that we might take stewardship for as something other than the thing that we inhabit or the space that we inhabit. Briefly, a second project. This is a visitor center in Abu Dhabi for the Al Watba wetland reserve. It's called the Flamingo Visitor Center. This is a wetland with a lot of natural species, although the Wetland was probably only in part natural and in part generated by human accident, spillage maybe from the water purification plant, whatever. It has turned into a natural reserve. And now there's also a plan broadly for the area for afforestation by the Abu Dhabi government. So we decided to design the project for the site as a kind of universally accessible public landscape. And as a ecological transition from the tertiary zone here, which is the kind of fully consolidated zone after afforestation, all the way to the primary zone of the wetland here, where there's still a lot of dynamic and where even the terrain might not be quite so stable. So some part of the project, again, is very visible as an architectural project. So we don't have to deny the fact that we are designing objects and that we're giving certain expressions to architecture. But some part of the building is also masked and protected by natural elements, or even integrated with it by way of forming an artificial dune as a kind of mediator between the primary and the tertiary vegetation zone. So this area connects into lots of tracks for visitors, hiking tracks. Again, we had the chance to explore a little bit Tim Ingold's idea of walking in the weather world and bringing the visitor in and out, this time not mud, this time sand in the building. What does it really imply? But here comes now a difficult question, something that we couldn't really resolve. So we tried to answer the afforestation plan for the government with the idea to reforest. We tried to also engage with the existing ecosystem of the wetlands. But what if one ecosystem starts dominating and the other one disappears? How do we deal with nature conservation? The German zoologist Josef Reichholf made a critique of contemporary nature preservation by saying we preserve snapshots. If there are somehow 300 elephants in an area, we try to keep it more or less on that number. He calls that dynamic equilibria. And he says that this is not really nature preservation, because nature preservation would be concerned about higher level processes, meaning evolution, which might mean that the elephants disappear. Yeah, this is a possibility. He calls that stable disequilibria. So with this project, we didn't really quite know what we were doing here in the long term. Now it comes down to realizing that these projects involve a long-term perspective on management. It's no longer a question, how long will the building be there, or have you delivered the building? What you're setting out as a possibility for an ecological transition might mean that the wetlands might be overgrown by trees over 2 centuries. Then what? How do you deal with this? A very difficult question, and it's something we need to further engage, because human management decisions might not always be the best decisions, and the total laissez-faire by an artificially set out condition is also a form of management. So this requires a lot of thinking still. Well, the project involved doing a lot of plant selection, investigating what is even there in the area, trying to see who are the different non-human stakeholders, trying to think about how would we even engage with geomorphic processes, this non-consolidated areas versus more consolidated areas, and so on. So not only the people walking might bring sand into the building, simple geomorphic processes might do that over time. They might bring sand closer. Do you go around the building with a bulldozer all the time, getting rid of the sand? Or do you let that happen? Interesting questions. Yeah, so with that in mind, I just wanted to recall, architects are beginning to do now different things. Engaging with different disciplines, asking different kinds of questions. And it's interesting that the result is not a total denial of architecture, because there are very clearly still very recognizable tectonic and aesthetic decisions which are being made, other decisions concerning program, etc., all thoroughly within the domain of architects, but now also intersected by a whole range of other considerations. And I think that is really the exciting thing about research, and it's the exciting thing about architecture. I never wanted to be this architect. But the architect that I just told you about is a very exciting prospect for me, because there's an open future. There's lots of interesting questions that are unresolved and that are waiting, even new questions to be discovered. So I hope I triggered your imagination a little bit for your own careers, for your own prospect, for your own perspective on what you want to do in the future. And I hope I also alerted you to the fact that maybe research in practice is one of the ways in which you might be able to keep things interesting for you, but you also need to keep up. You also need to engage with some form of lifelong self-development in that process. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. This was great. You touched on many points that we are discussing in this seminar about how architects do research, which is different from scientists, and how do we integrate our findings after, for instance, a data analysis into the design to make the design better. And I agree, there are many ways we can be architects. And in future, there will be different ways to be architects. So there is not one template anymore as described in this drawing from 1893. Ocean is an interesting practice, as you all saw, because it is intensively using research strategically for every project to do something, to touch on a deeper level of investigation that architects maybe haven't done a lot, you know. And it's actually interesting because it seems to be a small group around the world. I recognized a lot of people on your photos, from Ferdinand Ludwig to Mark Burry to Branko Koralevich and Billy Fairclough and so on, Matthias Schuler. There, you know, we're all talking in this a small group of people that are involved in leading research at universities and thinking about the future of architectural practice in a way. You mentioned that ways to effectively share the research is very important. You know, how do you disseminate new knowledge? Is it giving lectures at conferences, or is it publishing an article in a scholarly journal very few people will read, or is it writing an open ed piece in a newspaper? So there are many different ways how you do that. Of course, propagating our concepts to students in our daily work is also one way to disseminate our concepts and knowledge. It's very interesting. But let's talk about, I mean, you have this wonderful series of books that look into how different practices of different scale, different size. You said there's the very big one like Foster, and there's maybe Snøhetta, and then there's the smaller one, and then there is the 10-person practice that can never finance the research activities that those big powerhouses are doing. So how do you create an environment where research opportunities become possible, be it inside a practice, be it inside a lab or center or institute at a university? It is really about a research culture. To create opportunities for research to happen means you have to also submit grant applications. You have to write grant applications. It's the hard way to try to win some dollars to get the funding to do the research, to pay the PhD and the postdocs and so on. But also the concept of big data, something we might like to talk about. You know, today big data has become quite sinister. I remember 5 or 10 years ago, big data was, you know, the big buzzword. Everybody was into big data. Now, when you have data, you immediately think about, you know, how Google or Facebook are maybe controlling every move that we do, the big tech companies or government, how the IRS is maybe listening into our conversations and collecting big data about our privacy. So privacy protection, very important, but also how have you been able to then extract and analyze and interpret data? You have to explain it very well as a researcher, how you have dealt with the data to come to those conclusions, to those results, to those findings. So a lot of aspects that I'm throwing around here following your wonderful presentation. I think, you know, we should open it up. Are there any questions maybe from the students as a first move? Students, do you want to ask Professor Michael something about the research? Who wants to go first? Anybody? Don't be shy. If nobody wants to ask anything at the moment, we have a series of questions, I think, that are relevant, talking about the future of the city also, which is including a lot of the data. I mean, you would have come across new visions of eco-cities, be it the line at Neom in Saudi Arabia, 170 kilometer long linear mega project in the desert in Saudi Arabia, which throws up all kinds of questions. Does anybody want to live there? You know, it's all about control also. Or how are there other ways how research tells us how we can arrive at a more sustainable, healthy, green, resilient city structure? What about urban systems that we will implement in future, and urban systems that deal with the transformation of the existing city? Very important research area, of course. And I want to just ask you, Michael, how was your experience with the COVID-19 pandemic that now seems to be over? How has it impacted life in Vienna? Vienna, I know very well, is a city of around 2.5 million people, 3 million people, that is always at a cutting edge. It is at the same time a very traditional place, but what I love about Vienna is it also embraces new technology, new thinking, and it's always trying to be better. It's always ranking very high in the ranking of the most livable cities, sometimes of the top 3. And how is Vienna dealing now with city initiatives, making life more sustainable, healthy, and green in a post-pandemic situation? Can you tell us a little bit about that and how research could come in and maybe help a city? We see now at the moment, I'm asking this because Las Vegas is at a very interesting point. First of all, Las Vegas is a very interesting body to work on in terms of, as an urban designer, an architect, as a crazy laboratory of different conceptions of city and urban design. If you look at places like the Strip and the private tension between private investments that happen with big casinos doing their own idea of city, of course, that is much more about simulation, simulacrum, whereas you have surrounded ocean of suburbs, suburban life, and you have a high density core, a very interesting, very different model of city compared to, let's say, what you are encountering in Vienna. Can you tell us a little bit about your relationship to the city of Vienna? Are you involved with the municipality, and how does Vienna manage to include research in new city concepts? Do you want to talk about this? Would this be a good starting point?
Yes, absolutely. Well, where do I pick up? Let me pick up with COVID. Basically, no, I started at a different point. I started, Vienna is a city with a lot of green surrounding the city. You have Wienerwald, etc. You have there's a lot of green area. You have the river running through Danube. You have a big attempt by the government to declare large areas around the city as Habitat 2000, basically special protected areas for habitat, and so on. You have a big attempt to develop urban green networks. However, I mean, Vienna has a very large amount of green space, really, comparatively. However, there comes a limit when, and I mentioned that earlier on in my talk, when you only look at the available free space between buildings. There also comes a limit when you think that all that can be done on buildings are a thin green facade or thin green roof or plants in pots like Bosco Verticale. There are certain limits to each of these interventions. What Bosco Verticale showed, however, by Stefano Boeri in Milano, maybe most people of you might know that, is that it's actually possible to activate the building in some way. But the question has to go further. This is sort of plant selection done to also support a certain aesthetic of the building. You need flying gardeners to take care of stuff because the people living there are not allowed to, because a certain aesthetic has to be maintained. The trees have to be tied to the building with steel cables because there's not enough soil for the roots to keep the tree in place when there is a storm, and so on. So that is, in that sense, these building operations are actually plant killing machines. You need to permanently grow somewhere away from the building new plants to replace the ones that are dying on the building. So that cannot be the solution. What we're discussing currently in the Ecolabs research project is how we can activate buildings in this. Can we think of buildings as part of urban landform? Is it possible that maybe not every facade is a kind of vertical surface on which no other animal can reach, have a kind of territory to move on, and so on. Even widen the territory for animals, include more soil in the process, have more planting area, have more root depth, and so on. So this requires that we begin to think of buildings in a different way. However, I don't necessarily think that these projects like the 170-kilometer city demonstration project in Saudi Arabia will deliver a prototype, because for the simple reason, because most of our cities have grown over time and they need to be adapted over time. This operation in Saudi Arabia is built everything all at once, and that's it. And how often do we have the possibility? In Indonesia now, for the new capital, Canberra, Brasilia, but you count them more or less on one hand. Now, most of the bulk problem that we have is how do we gradually over time adapt our existing cities. That's why I do not favor at the moment some kind of large form, large urban object approach. We need to have something that works incrementally, where every small building operation can make a contribution. No? So landscape urbanism is interesting, but very often it's based on very large operations. And again, this is often not really quite possible in the city. But every day, all the time, non-stop, buildings are being replaced in buildings. They come down, new buildings go up. So if we find an approach where buildings incrementally can introduce a new landform, we work with the kind of processes that affect most cities and that are basically the mechanism or the logic of urban renewal for 98% of cities in the world. And there is research that geodiversity supports biodiversity, meaning that if we don't come with one large form that is only following one logic, an incremental build that brings more diversity into the urban landform, as I like to call it, is useful also for other purposes. But then came COVID. And COVID was a kind of hold on moment. You know, do we actually really want that close interface with nature because we could get sick? That's, of course, a vast overreaction. No? First of all, we have a lot of health and well-being benefits lost because we don't have a close human-nature interface. Yeah? So it's a trade-off. And it's a situation where we develop more and more kind of allergies and other kinds of things because we are not in touch with nature. So yes, we need to balance things. We should make sure, of course, that we don't propagate epidemics or pandemics through design, but at the same time, we also need to bring the conditions that are conducive to human health and well-being. Beside that, there's not only COVID as a kind of very daunting experience that has sort of offset human expectation. there's also simply what is acceptable. A lot of people might say, I don't want a big spider on the wall in my living room, or I don't want the birds pooping on my doormat in front of my row house or something like that. No? So that's a question of acceptance. We have, let's say, grown intolerant of these kinds of encounters, even though there is a lot of urban wildlife. I can only give you an example out of my own experience living in London for a long time. First time I had to cross a bridge with urban fox coming my way, I got really afraid, forgetting that rabies is not an issue in in the UK. They don't have rabies, but still I was wondering, what is that guy up to? And the guy had no interest in me. He just wanted to go past me to look in the rubbish bin for some uneaten sandwiches near the bus stop. And from then on, you know, every night we crossed paths, and it was quite all right. It was an encounter. It was became sort of a habit. So as much as it took maybe four or 5 decades for all of us to grow out of the expectation or the acceptance of these kinds of encounters, it will also take time to get used to them again. And we should, of course, take into consideration events like COVID, but we should not overreact, because the consequence cannot be that we don't develop a human nature interface, because we need it for our own health and well-being.
Good comments, thanks. I mean, obviously regreening cities and bringing nature and natural habitat back into the urban context is a huge trend at the moment we see everywhere, but also allowing for incremental change of a city or a project or a neighborhood over time is always the better way than trying to have tabula rasa. That's why the urban regeneration is so important of our existing cities. And some of the a question that comes up quite a lot is, what do you think, Michael, looking 10 years ahead out, what are the most likely significant changes you expect to see that will impact cities and their habitats in the next 10 years? What do you believe what will happen?
Well, I don't know what will happen, but I can maybe say what I think would need to happen. We have to work more with a broad spectrum of consequences of doing certain things. For instance, here I live in Munich, so in Germany very often urban densification, especially in the more outlying areas, means that single-family houses are disappearing, plots are joined, and then larger apartment blocks appear. And they also with underground parking, which often means that the entire soil of a plot is removed in order to make up to 6 meter, 7 meter depth, to put in the watertight underground parking, and then the apartment block with a certain setback. But it also means the soil above the garage towards the edge of the plot is only 30 centimeters with roll-out grass. Now, we have a problem that is probably also the case in many places in the United States. We have simultaneously droughts and flooding. The point is, we are not letting the water get into the ground because we're sealing the ground everywhere, which basically means that these areas are drying out. We have to run off the water through sewage systems and other kinds of means to other places where they go into a creek. The creek gets overfilled, like we had a huge disaster last year or so in the west of Germany, where hundreds of people died and buildings were destroyed, etc. So we are generating these problems. Now the question is, how do we respond to these problems? And I think that for me, the interesting and necessary thing would be that a lot of us would emulate more the Kieran Timberlake model, but at the same time also seek connections with interdisciplinary or with different disciplines and research groups to feed us. To me, this is not contrary to design. It's not constraining creativity. it's just opening new domains for creativity. You can still have an expressive building. As I showed to you, our buildings, they always have some very architectural part to it. And we do that on purpose, not because we want to be Zahadids, but we want to assure our colleagues that this way of working is not anti-architectural in the sense that there's no room for architectural expression. There is. Yeah, so it's not even self-serving. We don't want to show what great designers we are. We only want to show that there's a possibility for design that seems more familiar, that can be integrated with new domains for creativity and creative thinking. I mean, as architects, we are incredibly well versed to deal with a lot of seemingly contradictory requirements, synthesizing them into design. So opening the range of question doesn't mean more constraint, it means more territory for creative engagement. And I think that would be necessary to go fearlessly in this kind of direction. Then I see that some of the more complex things, problems that exist both on the scale range from local to territorial, can be addressed even through an incremental approach in cities. So I don't think, I never believed that science comes into the way of art or art comes into the way of science. I think the two domains and the humanities and all the rest of these domains have great capacity for collaborating and bringing up really interesting new opportunities to show what your capacity as a creative thinker that can bring a kind of new meaningful level of synthesis.
Thank you. Very good. Very good. And maybe follow up on the last question today. When you look at the different cities, they're all doing different things, and then they also start to learn more from each other, exchanging information, because many of them face the same issues, from waste management to traffic congestion to lack of affordable housing and so on. What do you think, what cities are leading the way now towards a green, healthy, sustainable environment? And how do those cities compare with US cities? You know, US cities, of course, you've been many times to the US. And the US city is quite different from the European city or the Asian city. The Australian city is maybe more similar to the US city, emulating those concepts of the suburbs. But what do you think, which ones are the cities we should look at particularly to learn from? And how do those activities and strategies happening there compare to where are the light tower projects in the US? Is it what New York is doing on its waterfront? Or is it San Francisco? Or what is your experience on that?
It's an interesting question, and I don't think that I have the breadth of knowledge to really answer that question. I'm not familiar with hundreds of cities and what exactly is happening there, but I would say another thing. I think wherever cities have mobilized, they do that on a good understanding of what the local resources is. For instance, a High Line makes a lot of sense in New York. Maybe somewhere else, something else would make more sense. So I think that the cities are doing a good job. But the issue is really, there is a certain status quo that doesn't get challenged. And I think as we are looking for new ways of advancing all the different interesting projects that are happening, a lot of things don't come into question for various reasons, but they should be put into question at least for the sake of speculation. For instance, the Garden City movement had some notion about which proportion of ground should remain in the ownership, in collective ownership, to be able to have a flexibility to do certain things. This has got nothing to do with socialism. This has got something to do with maintaining the ability to manage and adapt and transform the environment in certain ways. Also, the other thing that could become a very important field of investigation is what kind of established practices for occupying ground exist. In Scandinavia, there's the so-called all man's right, which is a kind of version of the right to roam and occupy natural or privately owned natural areas. And this comes from medieval customary rights. So when you go through a gate, close it behind you so that cattle doesn't disappear. You're allowed to camp on somebody's private ground for 4 days, but don't disturb the private sphere of the house, which is not described. It's culturally ingrained. People understand what to do. You can collect some apples, but don't break the branches and so on. You can use the waterways, but please not with motorboats more than with the speed and so on. So there is a kind of customary right-based regulation of how grounds can be occupied. And looking at this historically is very important because we treat public grounds often in the West as something generic and exchangeable, even though it might have a local flavor. Yeah. To give an example, in the Near and Middle East, public space originates from soft ground, from grassland, where you would put up your tent encampment, and you would utilize the ground in between collectively. So it's not the hard urban surface square that is ingrained historically in the way in which people occupy space. But whenever you go to Istanbul, you will find a very interesting phenomenon that people sit even on the little leftover green areas between inner urban motorways and do their picnic. Why? Because that's traditionally, historically, the way of occupying public ground, of utilizing public ground. No? That's why people demonstrated about what was happening in the center of town when an important square was supposed to be converted from a green area to a shopping mall. It was basically an insistence by citizens that there should be something that they can connect with in terms of practices of occupying ground. So I think certain amount of, let me say the word contextualism is useful, but the contextualism is not so much about formal expression. It's more about material solutions related to common practices. Yeah. So for instance, having a soft green square in a culture where this is actually the space that you occupy collectively in certain ways for certain events, you gather socially in certain kinds of ways that are different from another place. So putting a hard surface instead doesn't really do the job. Yeah, so I think we have to take a little bit more, we have to be a little bit more sensitive to that. And I also very much like the suggestion of Tim Ingold that walking through an environment, especially when it is a natural environment, is a way of becoming knowledgeable about it. And I would extend that. How can you really embrace stewardship without having an interest in something and having a little bit of knowledge of something and finding yourself in that setup because you have a certain affinity to the way things are laid out. So whether New York is something, the High Line is something that should be repeated in many places, I don't know. When the opportunity occurs, maybe, but we should take all these other things into consideration when we do that. So the High Line in New York will probably not be the same way as the High Line in Athens or the High Line in Shanghai. No, there must be differences somehow for some reason, even if it only rains more or I don't know what.
You picked a very interesting example because every city now wants to copy and repeat the success of the High Line. Sydney is doing one, and everywhere around the world. So very interesting. So site-specific solutions, and there is not a formula that works everywhere. It's also very much about common sense solutions, as you pointed out. We have a question here in the chat, maybe a last one from Philip. He says, "Thank you, Michael, for sharing your knowledge. Nice and interesting presentation. Since you started Oceans, have you incorporated the swift advance of technologies in the last 5 years and research tools in order to anticipate many challenges?" So how you incorporate technological change? Is the question here in terms of research tools. GI.
In different ways, but I think what a lot of it is pointing towards, especially in the work of my wife, is decision support for planning and design. So that typically incorporates a broad range of, for instance, computer-aided methods and approaches. For instance, knowledge engineering approaches, utilizing computational ontologies, connecting different databases, especially from different domains into this, utilizing simulations, utilizing machine learning, artificial intelligence in the process. A lot of that goes towards decision support, and frankly speaking, that is something that is really required for people who in governance, who set out the frameworks within which we operate. It is required for people in planning that, again, hand to architects the kind of regulations that are more particular in terms of governing what is possible on a given site. So this is really important, and these tools enable and this approach enables the incorporation of multi-domain knowledge that goes over a broad scale range and so on, so that also small offices that cannot have 20 experts sitting there are able to tap into something and to get some kind of feedback, understanding the co-benefits or trade-offs between different requirements that they have to fulfill. No? So it's basically going a lot in that direction. Of course, we also use individual methods, but you know, we can discuss that at length. For me, the more important thing is you have a workflow. If you pick something to work with, how does it sit in the workflow and what kind of role does it play in it? I'm supposed to give a talk in 10 days about simulation at the ETH in Zurich, and I don't really know what to say about that topic alone. Of course, I can talk about simulation, but it's totally out of context. You know, I first need to say, what do I want to do? What is my design problem? What is my problem space even? How do I define that? What is my solution space? Where is this becoming somehow different because I work with different experts from different domains? And after a while, when I then begin to realize how I need to set myself up conceptually and methodologically, then I may begin to contemplate the role of different methods and tools. But just to sit down and talk about simulation sort of in general, I think there are too many experts already. I don't have anything to add to that.
I agree.
So for me, this is difficult, you know.
And also the research question, of course, that is the driver, and the knowledge gap. And then based on that, what kind of methods, mixed methods you select to analyze the data, and how do you gather what kind of data? You mentioned decision support. This is huge here now in the US. Decision support systems involving different stakeholders is very, very important, how this emerged over the last years as a lot of researchers are working in this field. Okay, listen, this was great. Thank you very much for being so generous with and frank with your answers and generous with your time, Michael. It's been fantastic. And we say really thank you very much for your very spot on lecture contribution at that point of our discussion as a group, as a cohort, academic community, discussing exactly around those issues. How will research be integrated and shape the future of practice? So thank you very much, Michael. Great to have one of the experts on that topic with us today. And I send all my warmest wishes and regards to Vienna. Don't let your heart be troubled. And we thank you all from Las Vegas, and I hope to catch up with you soon. Students, don't go. We still have to present now, and we say bye-bye to Professor Michael Hensel. Thank you very much.
Okay, I thank you very much for having me here. I just wanted to say because the students have been so shy to ask any questions. You are welcome to share my email address with them in case something comes up and you want to ask. So you're most welcome to contact me if something comes up. I feel sorry because I'm not sure whether this was something useful for you or not, because we didn't really have a chance much to interact, but feel free to contact me. So thanks to all of you.
I think it was very useful. It was very useful. Thank you, Michael. Yeah.
Stay healthy, take care, and best of luck to all of you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Ciao.
All right, so lots of good information here. I agree, great. So let's go then on and have a 5-minute break. Now is 9:56. I see you 1 minute after 10, and then we go through the 9 teams presenting on where you are at, just to get an overview, who's working on what, and who's targeting which funding body, and what are your research questions. Okay, see you in 5 minutes. Thanks.